Mr. Wilson. Mr. Tom Garrett of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank my colleague Joe Wilson and the ambassador, because I heard something that really I thought was succinct and insightful, and that is, I believe, paraphrasing, there are threats greater than an Islamist insurgency that's nationalist in its nature. So we recognize that while the Taliban is bad, that ISIS, which has a global sort of orientation, is probably worse, which doesn't eradicate our responsibility to address the Taliban, particularly as it relates to sort of if you break it, you buy it, and the circumstances on the ground in Afghanistan. But let me go for a moment down that road. I think we fail when we overlap an American paradigm on the foreign affairs arena. Americans presume that when we deal with other nations, there's a strong, preeminent federal government. I would argue that in Afghanistan right now, try as they might, there's not that they aspire to have a strong, preeminent federal government, but the fact that you can't drive from the airfield to the compound without enhanced security measures would indicate that, in fact, the control of the centralized government in Afghanistan isn't what they like for it to be, the security apparatus, et cetera. So we need to understand the reality on the ground, and whatever country that we're dealing with, in this case Afghanistan, doesn't mirror that which we've become familiar with here at home. Number two, we talk about the Taliban. And I would posit and seek your comment in a moment on the fact that I would argue at this juncture there is no the Taliban, there are Talibans. In other words, there's no unified central control of Taliban-oriented elements as there was, say, for example, under Mullah Omar, but instead sort of disparate warlords with some overlap as it relates to their interests who act in many instances autonomously, thus creating an even harder circumstance for folks like yourself, Ambassador Wells, and any NATO forces, coalition forces, and the federal government of Afghanistan to deal with, because we see things like atrocities committed against civilian contractors driving supplies, et cetera, that are documented on the internet, which obviously the useful end to those would be manifold, that is to intimidate those who would work for the federal government, to intimidate the coalition, et cetera, perpetrated by subgroups of the Taliban but not endorsed by other groups. Elliot Engel said in his opening comments, you need not make peace with your friends, which I thought was insightful in and of itself. And yet there are Taliban elements that have expressed, I would argue, differing degrees of willingness to sit down and talk. And there are those who will probably be, for lack of a better, more artistic term, dead enders. So with that as a basis, the money for the narcotics industry in Afghanistan does not flow, I would ask, directly to the government. Is that correct?
Sorry, the money from where?
So the money from the narcotics industries in Afghanistan, the poppy fields, et cetera, does not flow directly to the federal government. Some of it ends up there, but it doesn't, correct?
No.
But the aid that's administered to Afghanistan from the United States, its allies, the coalition, if you will, does flow through the government, correct?
It flows through, a portion of it flows through a trust fund that's administered by the World Bank.
Right.
And then the remaining money, with just a very little bit of an exception, is administered separately on off-budget programs administered by USAID and others.
What I'm driving at, yes, ma'am. And so what I'm driving at, though, is that perhaps have we considered a paradigm wherein we tie aid and development to Afghanistan to eradication efforts? In other words, the government benefits and hopefully strengthens itself as it relates to creating a stable, sustainable Afghanistan where there's as broad a spectrum of hope moving forward as possible, more directly from revenues from the international community than from the narcotics developing community, correct?
But the challenge we face is 85% of opium is produced in Taliban-controlled or contested areas. And so, again, this is a security issue, I think, as a first cut.
But you've said earlier today that the government of Afghanistan has indicated an interest in not undergoing eradication programs at this juncture. Is that an accurate assessment?
Yes, the government would assess that it would increase the appeal, perhaps, of insurgent organization.
Right, and so it's something to talk about. I'm not dictating that this is what I think the policy should be, but if you look at what the actual functioning federal government, to the extent that it exists in Afghanistan, derives benefit from, I would submit that if they were given an either-or, they'd probably fall on the side we wanted them on. Going really quickly, there is a man-cap tax on contractors in Afghanistan that we've become aware of that stems from the Karzai regime, which is arbitrary and probably not consistent with existing agreements. Has anything been done to address that? Because what it does ultimately is it taxes the American citizens as we pay for contractor missions to develop infrastructure, security, et cetera, by virtue of creating additional costs. Has anybody done anything about this man-cap tax? Are you familiar with that, which I'm speaking of?
I'm not, but we can follow up.
Thank you so much. I've run out of time. Thank the chairman. Thank you, Ambassador Wells.
Thank you,
Pleasure.
Mr. Garrett. Thank you very much. And I